we can. Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and in this series of programs, we examine matters of public importance to Guyana, all Guyanese, wherever they are, at home or abroad. And today we're looking at the matter which concerns 1 out of every 5 Guyanese. We're talking about our children who are in schools. And yes, we're talking about over 150,000 Guyanese children are probably in the education system in 550 schools or thereabouts. But there is a problem affecting them all and affecting us, and a problem that will continue to affect Guyana and the future if we don't solve that problem. And that is the problem of violence. That is the problem of violence in our schools. And this month of February is particularly bitter. It's the 10th anniversary of one of the worst incidents of stabbing in our schools. And this occurred, in February 2013. And of course, former Neil Miggins was stabbed by a former 10 years ago in February. It's a bitter commemoration, if you want to call it that, but it's something that we should regard as both symbolic and maybe symptomatic of what is still taking place in Guyana. My friends, this year, financial year 2023, Guyana will be expending over $94 billion in the education sector. And it is a large amount, and obviously we all want to make sure that that money is correctly spent. That money is meant to be spent to pursue education excellence. And at the same time, we must aim at preventing violence among our 145,000 to 150,000 students in over 547 schools. And it will be an exacting task for the people who are managing that huge sum of $94 billion. We all want to make sure that the money is well spent. The fact is that 25% of our teachers, there are nearly 12,000 teachers, 25% of them are untrained. Now, you wouldn't fly in an airplane with an untrained pilot. You wouldn't allow yourself to undergo surgery with an untrained doctor. But here we are in Guyana, 25% of our teachers are untrained. And only about 36% are males. Now, I'm not going to interrogate these figures, but they have consequences. When you know that a significant percentage of the teachers are not trained and a significant percentage of the teachers are female, we know that there will be consequences. I'm not criticizing one or the other, but there are reasons why so many women are in teaching and so few men. But these are matters that we need to consider perhaps as another program. We are looking at the problem of everyday violence in Guyana, in our schools. The defiance of teachers' authority has become commonplace. Violence by parents to teachers is a not infrequent occurrence. Last year, 2022, there were 6 reports of teacher-parent confrontation. And there were 19 reports of physical altercation between students. Of course, there are probably more, but these are the official reports that were made and published in the press. There are 33 reports of violence and about 8 reports of the sale of drugs in schools and drug use. These figures are unnerving. Drug trafficking is a crime. It's not a prank. And we need to take a serious approach to these problems in our schools. We like to think that, boys will be boys. And, this is not just boyish pranks. These are crimes. and he must deal with crimes in the way that the general public deals with crime. Violent behavior is not something casual. It is learned, and people who behave in a violent way, especially in the school system and education system, will do damage to your children's education. Violence is bound to erode education, not only for the present generation, but for future generations. And don't forget, this is an important time in a child's life. Roughly, a child may spend up to 15 years in the education system. And if a child is exposed to violence by peers or parents in that time, you can see uh, that violence will live with the child for the rest of his or her life. And we must understand that once the education system becomes violent, people will migrate. Educated people will migrate, and they'll go to safer countries. I recall personally when I was in the Bahamas, I went to one of the islands, um, and in one primary school, there were 25 Guyanese-born graduate teachers. I mean, they were very proud of being Guyanese. They wrapped themselves in the golden arrowhead and sang the national anthem for me, to the amazement of the Bahamians. But they didn't go there because they dislike Guyana. They go there because they are safe and they're well paid. And we must not chase away our bright students because our schools are violent places. Uh, when children particularly are exposed to violent parents at home, they're encouraged to behave in a violent way when they go to school. They feel that's the way to get things done. Parents have a responsibility. They are responsible for inculcating values and standards in their own children. And sometimes when you see a child behaving in a disorderly way, a violent way at school, it could be because there's low emotional attachment to their parents at home. There's low self-esteem, and this is a big problem. Sometimes children are embarrassed or ashamed, and sometimes the families are dysfunctional. There's just too much conflict within the families. And when children come to school and are troubled, maybe sometimes they are treated. Of course, teachers, when you think of a school with 400 or 500 children, sometimes the children's complaints or the children's problems are treated as in a dismissive way. Sometimes the behavior is treated as a minor a misdemeanor, when in fact it could be some deep-seated problem. In particular, we need to inculcate respect for our teachers. Um, Unless children are taught to respect their teachers, the school system will not be effective. And I particularly want to refer to the case of Sean Marshall at Graham's Hall Primary School earlier this year in January. This is January. This was recorded in late January. But he was badly beaten by a parent. And similarly, at St. Andrew's School back in January, a teacher was beaten by a parent. Let us be clear. Assault is a crime. Assault is not a prank. It's not a legitimate means for expressing your anger. It's a crime. It's a crime committed in the plain sight of children and other teachers. And this is bound to have an impact on the education system. And then you have a problem of suicide, bullying, and depression and shame, has have caused several students to commit suicide over the last decade, within recent memory. Sometimes even elite schools. So don't believe, that suicide is a problem for schools in poor or depressed areas. Very elite schools, have had cause for suicide. Hinterland and coastland. Uh, Recently, we had, well, not recently, in 2020, December 2020, there was a case of suicide at Suesdyke. And then in 2021, there was a case of suicide at St. Stanislaus College. There's one in J.C. Chandy Singh School. There's one in Madhya. So here we are, coastal and hinterland, urban and rural. So we don't want to stereotype particular places in order to prove that that type of person is likely to behave in a certain way. These problems are far too widespread to be dismissed. And then, of course, we had a bigger problem now, the problem of arson. Sometimes, persons who should know better, speak about arson as a sort of political uh, vendetta or a political action. But let us not forget that last year we marked 25 years since what is regarded as the prime secondary school in Guyana, Queen's College, was nearly completely destroyed. In fact, the damage was at that time at those prices was over $500 million. And we know who was responsible for it. November 1997. Yes, last year was the 25th anniversary of the Queen's College fire. And that was probably the worst case of arson, deliberately set arson. Arson, not a prank. It's not a schoolboy's prank, it's a crime. And it was a precedent, perhaps, for what has taken place more recently. North Rhine Belt Multilateral School, at St. George's Secondary School, Mabaruma Secondary School, Christchurch Secondary School, up to January 2023. Arson is serious. It's not a question of simply, a disgruntled student expressing his anger. It affects the lives and livelihood of, well, of course, the teachers and other students. And it's difficult to understand why people don't take a stand against situations or conditions which allow arson to take place and allow persons to behave in such a way. I don't know. I'm not blaming anyone. I don't know who was responsible for the fire at Christchurch or St. George's. It might be electrical, whatever it is. But what I'm saying is that schools, and you're talking about, a huge number of primary schools and secondary schools all over the country, and over nearly 600 schools. So yeah, it's difficult for anybody, any one person in the Ministry of Education to keep an eye on all of them. But they have to be systems, and perhaps in this program and perhaps other programs, we can look to see how we can prevent this type of behavior. But arson is not a prank, it's a crime, and we have to pay attention to that. And there are other issues too. The gangs, their guns, there's gambling, and there's sex. Now I'm talking about children. I'm not talking about adults. When I'm talking about gangs and guns and gambling, you're talking about young adults. You're talking teenagers in the school system, and we know very well the so-called Gaza and Gully phenomenon is copied from the Jamaican dancehall culture, Vibes Cartel and Movado. And whether or not people still see the link between Movado and the gangs, I've been to secondary schools and seen gangs and mark the logos, Gaza and Gully. It's not a good import, we shouldn't imitate some of the things that we see these dancehall people doing. But for over a decade, this Gaza and Gully phenomenon has affected our schools. But what is happening now is that children in our secondary schools, divide themselves into gangs. And if you were in one gang, you could be beaten by children in another gang. And if you don't, join a gang, well, then you'll be beaten into submission anyway. It's not a good development, and it must be stamped out. And this has been going on for over a decade, maybe 12 years. So from the moment the sort of cartel and Movado phenomenon arose, and then you have children carrying weapons. Any day, any day you search children's haversack, you come up with offensive weapons. Sometimes as bad as guns, most times with knives and what people call a juka. Um, and then of course there's sex uh, and gambling. Gambling leads to disputes. Gambling has no place among school children. There will always be a fight over winnings, and people try to settle their own point of view with some form of weapon, either fight or the use of weapons. And then there's sexual abuse. Sometimes there's competition between girls or boys for the sexual favors of somebody else in the school. But sexual abuse of minors is a crime. And right now, I think there are at least two secondary school teachers who have been arraigned before the courts on charges of raping female students. And it's very pervasive. It's very pervasive. And it is something that I don't regard as inevitable. It's something that has to be stamped out. But these are all symptoms of the decay of the school culture that we must admit that once you have co-educational schools, boys and girls will be attracted to one another. But we just have to make sure that sexual activity, takes place within legal, if it takes place at all. But there must be better education, so that what takes place doesn't disrupt people's life. And too many girls, because the girls suffer first and they suffer most, they are forced to drop out of school if whatever sexual activity they engage in results in pregnancy. And teen pregnancy is a big problem countrywide. And we need to look at these problems within our educational system. My friends, all of this leads to the conclusion that we need to adopt measures which ensure that school violence is reduced. There must be an imposition of certain values and standards, and students' misbehavior, the disregard for school rules, usually are correlated to what's taking place in society at large. And of course, parental relations. It doesn't mean that every student who witnesses this misbehavior at school will adopt that behavior. And a lot of what influences a student comes from the parents, and but of course society, because you just imagine the amount of waking hours the student spends in with his peers, his or her peers, compared with the amount of time he or she spends with their parents. And very often the peers have greater influence on student behavior than the parents. And this is something that needs to be considered. Once children suffer in their homes and in their schoolyards, we must see where these influences come from. And unfortunately, in Guyana, this century started with a very prolonged and traumatic period of violence, which we call the Troubles. And children who were, very young, 4 or 5 years old, in the early part of the century, are now, 15 or 20 years old. And when they go to school in the mornings and they see maybe dead bodies, or at night they're shooting in their villages, um, and you know these events can have long-lasting effects. Look what happened in West Coast Babis at Bath and Bushlot villages on 6th of March. Can you imagine PPP protesters pelting a school bus in broad daylight on Friday the 6th of March? I mean, and the injury to those, 12, 13, and 14-year-old students, they wouldn't forget, they remember that forever. If this is the disdain or dislike or disregard that adults, whether or not they feel justified that they're protesting about something they perceive, in the elections, these children were innocent. The children were innocent, and those children will remember the injuries because one had to be hospitalized. And there were two villages, both Bath and Bushlot were affected, 6th of March, 2020. And children remember those incidents forever. They will remember those incidents forever. My friends, people have dismissed the notion of social cohesion, and unless there's greater social cohesion, I firmly believe, unless we introduce and propagate social cohesion, whatever you choose to call it, these harmful cultural and political and religious and social beliefs will continue to distort our relationships in Guyanese society. These behaviors must be curbed. We have to learn to understand and appreciate other cultures, other religions, other ethnic practices and beliefs. And we have to foster social cohesion. It will not happen automatically. It has to be promoted in a positive way. And sometimes children are exposed to violent language, maybe inflammatory language and ideas from their adults, sometimes in music, sometimes in the mass media. And all of these are contributory factors to violent behavior. And it contributes to disrespect for elders and for teachers. And this is very bad. We need to plan better. We need to plan better for the educational development of our country and our children. Violence occurs very frequently in schools which are under-resourced and overcrowded. They have low levels of attendance, high levels of dropouts and delinquency. For example, about 1,200 students have dropped out since 2020, and the majority coming from the most populated regions, regions 4, 6, 7, 8. Well, 7, 8, and 9 are not heavily populated. The 7, 8, and 9 are essentially hinterland regions, the Kuni, Mazruni, Pataro, Separuni, and the Rupaluni. But still, the dropout rate is very hard, very heavy. And we must ask ourselves why this is happening. And we had hoped that, well, of course, APNUFC is no longer in office. We had hoped that the capital towns, Bartica, Mabaruma, Mahdi, and Letham, would have A-grade secondary schools, that is, schools where people can take the A-levels and schools, so that they don't have to come to Georgetown. So part of our education plan was to put top-grade secondary schools in those capital towns, just like the PNC did, in the early years after it got into office and built those multilateral schools at Anna Regina, Bladen Hall, New Amsterdam, and so on. We need, well, the multilateral concept is gone now, but we need first-rate secondary schools in Bartica, Mahdia, Mabaruma, and Letham as well, so that hinterland students don't have to come to town. And we must remember too that not because a school is located in Georgetown, even if it's burnt down or destroyed or abandoned, it has to be built in the same place. We need to have a concept of building schools in a green belt. And let me say this, one of the reasons for Queen's College's success is that it moved away from Brigham into the Thomas lands. St. Joseph's moved away from Charlestown, into Thomas land. And we must create a green belt of schools. So every school should have grounds, maybe even swimming pools where children could exercise, have athletics, games, sports, and swimming. And building schools in urban centers is not a good idea. And many of these were old church schools. When perhaps the mostly Christian churches were responsible for primary education, but things have changed now, and we need to take our schools out of congested urban areas, even if they're destroyed by fire. And I don't agree with arson, of course, but even they're destroyed or they're decrepit, get them out, build them in green spaces so that children could practice their sports and their athletics and their exercises and their games, and not fight one another in schools. Let them get engaged in social and physical activities which encourage healthful competition rather than violent conflict. And I would like to say that the APNU AFC embraces change. And when we were in office, 2015 to 2020, we did introduce this Champions for Change clubs, which is a CARIFORUM project, but it was aimed at reducing the incidence of violence in and out of school by engaging young people and students in after-school programs, building their capacity to address crime and violence from a social perspective. My friends, where are we going from here? What is the future like for our children? How will we get out of this vortex of violence? I would like to propose a 5-point approach. I don't think school violence is something casual, it is structural. And we need to look at structural change if we are to get out of this vortex of violence. First, there must be investment in teacher training. The Cyril Potter College of Education is of paramount importance, and what happens to the teachers there will determine how that teacher behaves and performs in school. I remember when I was president, we got a grant from the People's Republic of China to be used for whatever project we thought was important, and immediately the full grant, over $50 million, went straight to Cyril Potter College of Education. Over $50 million. Without blinking, I passed that money on to Cyril Potter College of Education. We need to invest more and more in teacher training. The teachers have to be properly trained because they are responsible for molding the next generation of Guyanese, the next generation. Every teacher must be trained. Right now, 25% of the teachers are untrained. There's no place for untrained teachers in our classroom. And they must be trained not only in academic subjects, they must be trained to handle the modern problems of our students in our schools. So apart from investment, there must be close attention to infrastructure. Many of our church schools, and I went to 3 church schools. I went to Anglican school, Bardic, Church of Scotland school, what they call Presbyterian now, on the Quarantine, and a Moravian school in Georgetown, and a Roman Catholic school. And they were all old wooden buildings. The other day I saw a photograph of Walk Line. Oh, yes. There was a lot of nostalgia, but those schools were maybe suited to the 1940s, not suited to 2020s. We need a new generation of schools. We need modern schools. Those old wooden former church schools with the latrine outside, uh, they don't have place in modern Guyana. They're uncomfortable, they're unsafe, they're unhealthy, and they're unsuited to modern education. And most of them are overcrowded and overbearing. It is not a pleasure to go to schools in those circumstances, in those conditions. We need to have a new type of school, new designs of school, which are more healthy and can provide better coverage. This is what was attempted by the PNC administration in the 1970s with the multilateral schools. They're more spacious, they have proper gymnasiums, they have places for school farms, they have proper canteens, but the old church schools have served their purpose, and now we must, well, unfortunately, Christ Church schools and Georgia schools, the very names tell you they're church schools. They're they're inappropriate for modern education, and we need now to plan for the future for the next 10 years in our infrastructure. There needs also to be, thirdly, um, a uniform code of conduct. There needs to be the implementation of a uniform code of conduct or code of behavior. The Ministry of Education actually has one, which was, crafted since 2020. Their guidelines, but those proposed rules have to be updated, and every teacher must have those guidelines or uniform code of behavior um, right there in a laptop or in a hard copy, so that all of the students' attendance, the assignments, the attitude, the discipline, the dress, decorum, punishment, all the issues affecting the management of our students must be catered for. And we must have those guidelines, or a code, a uniform code of behavior available to every student, every parent, and every teacher. That is essential. Fourthly, information technology is no longer a novelty. It is no longer a privilege for the elite and the rich. And we learned that lesson from the pandemic. Information technology is essential to modern education, especially in Guyana, where we have far-flung schools and regions. The best way to ensure distance education is to have um, the entire educational system linked by a network. The geographical space is too vast for the old-fashioned education school where you sent out the schoolmaster to some distant village. Now is the era of information technology, and this must be introduced much more vigorously in every single school in this country. Even 70 years ago when I was in school, we had learning by radio. So although radio is now not regarded as a very advanced form of communication, we now have computers, and the implementation of information technology communications in education over our extensive geographical space. And it caters for, but I hope there are no more pandemics. When you consider what happened between 2020 and now, a lot of students were out of school. A lot of students have dropped out of school permanently, but information technology could bridge the gap and maybe could bring a lot of students who dropped out back into the education system. And finally, there must be more innovative teaching techniques in order to curb violence, which, as you see, is changing. It's changing because the social media is changing because of behavior, it's changing because of gangs and drugs. Society doesn't stand still, and you need to have innovative techniques in order to cope with the spate of arson and assault and bullying and stabbing and suicide. And people in the education ministry, people in the education system cannot be complacent. They have to confront these present day problems with new innovative techniques. My friends, They're over 20%, maybe more than 1 in 5 Guyanese are now in the education system. They're in schools. 1 in every 5 Guyanese. And those of us who are adults will have to hand over Guyana to the students. We have to ensure that they are prepared to take leadership of this country into the next decade, into the future. We must stop fighting in our schools. We must stop fighting each other. We must stop fighting our teachers. We must stamp out violence among the present and future generations. For God's sake. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Let us cooperate for the young. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must